Thanks everyone for attending this talk. I'm primarily going to be talking about the Pink Apocalypse series that are most of which are on view at the Ohio Wesleyan Gallery. And the work in the gallery primarily starts conversations about place and crisis and the way that that intersects with gender. And a lot of us still to this day are interfacing with lots of looming changes that affect us in our immediate environments. And these paintings are sort of structured by my own personal experience of those those intersections in my own life. I will say that throughout the slideshow today, there'll be like quotes from like poems or songs too that I might not read and will sort of go past. I tend to be thorough, and that's like both a strength and a weakness. So these are the only two older works I'm mentioning, just in interest of the line of thinking that's led me to these works. Some of my older works still had a really strong interest in patterns of behavior, especially regarding gender. And these paintings were set within the domestic sphere and thinking about the ways that our homes and families and our specific places reinforce and introduce patterns that can be sometimes constructive and sometimes not so constructive that we sort of repeat. And so in these two images, the one on the left, my back that's facing you in the pink robe sort of echoes the form of my grandmother's back as she's moving through this superimposed space. And it's all sort of taking place on this damask patterned rug that's moving through the space. And I'm thinking about a lot about the ways that I really strongly relate to my grandmother, where we have a lot of behavioral similarities. We share a lot of ways of being, such as liking really over the top femme clothes and fashion, being really bubbly and loquacious, but also struggle with mental illness in the same way. And so a lot of the ways that I've copied her have brought a lot of joy to my life, and other ways that I follow her paths are things that we both really deeply struggle with. And so that's sort of infused in here as well. And the image on the right of this little girl sort of in this space holding her throat as this pattern proliferates the space coming out of this baby cradle. I'm just sort of thinking about the ways that, expectations for performing gender are suffocating, even as soon as you sort of come out of the womb. And they're always sort of there. And the way that that's sort of felt in that painting with the reflection behind this little girl, sort of like she's in this desert, like totally alone. And there's just like this intense pattern co-present with her in the space. And I think that a lot of the reason that I think about this so heavily too is also due to the fact that I am from an immigrant family and have seen the ways that my grandmother has gone above. She's really performed American, white American femininity in a lot of ways that she looks like a completely different person before and after immigration. And she sort of like took up the mantle of like the perfect 1960s housewife look, like lost a ton of weight, like wore a perfect beehive hairstyle every day from like dusk until dawn, and did everything in the household, and still does to this day. When she can't, she's like so hard on herself for different reasons. And watching the ways that those forces she still struggles with and tries to share awesome things with me, like her vintage clothes, but also not so awesome things with me, like perfectionism and self-deprecation when you can't perform up to standards that you feel are imposed on you, have always been really heavy in a lot of different ways. So in the most recent work that started since I moved here to Kentucky, really, I think it's important to look at the first study in the series, Watchers. I moved to Kentucky, rural Western Kentucky in 2017, and experienced a really big difference in my access to resources, to proximity to cultural centers, to proximity to grocery stores that have ingredients of things that I like to eat, and found myself also really uncomfortable with how vast the space is around me, and sprawling sort of farmland country, and direct sunlight, and being able to see absolutely nothing but fields or openness for miles, and felt this really intense fear of exposure in a lot of ways that really kind of made me chafe. And in addition to just like an intense adjustment that I experienced in being so far from home, especially, going to Ohio Wesleyan and Miami, which were both within 4 hours of home, where it felt like a safe place for me that was like in between in a lot of the ways that I grew up. And Kentucky's totally different from that. And I started making these paintings where women are on the sort of precipice of the domestic frontier, like right on their front porch, interfacing with watching something in these big, vast, distant spaces. And I didn't really understand fully where these images were coming from, but I was constantly afraid of being asked to do all this outdoor stuff that I was really had intense fear of exposure with. And as I was sorting that out through the painted space, this painting, I think, really solidified for me what these were really about. This painting, Indelible, from 2019, I'm really thinking about, the way that as a survivor, I have of sexual trauma, I have an intense fear of being in an unfamiliar environment and being in places where I feel like my body is unsafe or that I physically could be threatened in some capacity. And so in this painting, where I started sort of with myself being situated as this frontal figure, almost like a video game character ready to sort of interact with what's forward, there's this sort of boundary between me and this sea of bunch of white men in suits that are further away from me and sort of abstracted. And I'm really thinking about the way that there's sort of this wall there, and there's an effort that had to be put there, right? Like it had to be built either by me or by them or some other force. That's sort of this chasm here. And I'm sort of alone, and I'm asking a question in this painting about whether my figure is sort of in danger or if she's really fearless. It's sort of this moment of an impasse and asking this really big question. A lot of the time, people that are survivors who do also encounter agoraphobia perceive environments where they have little to no control over where they are, over their bodies, as also being really scary because you don't know if you're going to have a panic attack. That's something I experience often, and there's just like this intense effort of self-protection constantly. And so that sort of happened in this painting. And what I thought was also really interesting was that I made this painting in 2019 after kind of absorbing the shock of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's really brave testimony in the hearings against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh as a survivor herself. And this moment in history was both empowering for me as a survivor and forced me to sort of confront some of the gender trouble that was going on in my paintings previously that was sort of under the surface, but it was also triggering intense to watch the outcomes and backlash and the way that this was all happening. And it's just sort of interesting seeing this image where she's sort of testifying this row of men in suits before her. It's really similar sort of to this composition. But yeah, this moment really fueled my openness and touched a nerve and making me feel less afraid to develop my work to be about myself outside of my family and outside of the domestic, and about me confronting social forces outside of just my immediate house, especially in the times that we're in right now, right? And so the 5 major things I've broken down this talk into, I've put paintings in the categories of witnessing change, we're constantly witnessing turns of events politically, environmentally, socially, and what that feels like within a painted space. Imagined reckonings, which I'll get to, feelings of sort of like uncertain trust between figures in a time of crisis or change, enduring wounds and trauma and infectious patterns, and then finally conjuring agencies, some paths forward or other ways that of thinking about building something new out of looking at these things. So this is just sort of a list of some of the things I'm going to talk about throughout the talk tonight. And if you want me to come back to any of these topics at the end of the talk, feel free. But these are just some sort of big words that I'll come back to across various paintings. All these categories, I've also included some artist influence that I don't have time to talk about, but just shows you where my head's at and who I'm looking at as well as I introduce that category. In this witnessing change section, I'm thinking about the way that I often experience, and many survivors often experience, a looming sense of doom. And this series of works use the word apocalypse, which is an event that involves damage or destruction in a catastrophic scale, but could also be implicative of disclosure of or revelation of great knowledge that was previously not there. And so I feel like I often expect the worst, but I often expect that there's like other information that could be coming to light, and that's also something that we've been seeing within the Me Too movement often, and then also as other social issues have progressed over the last couple of years, it's sort of also constantly we've got a sense of doom, and we're also gaining new information that's enriching our understanding of our situation as well. And so these works sort of just show images where the sky is falling or changing, and figures are interacting and interfacing with that change and trying to wrap their heads around it and figure out what to do. In the painting on the left, Open Seas, is a revision of that initial study, Watchers, that I showed at the beginning. And the two figures are in this vast open field, and this pattern is being carried in. There's sort of this question about what's being carried in on the breeze, and what is it? Is it harmful? Is it good? What kind of change is it? And I'm very open to that changing and interpreting in different ways throughout the work. And go on, I started thinking about, okay, well, what if the sky was really changing and pinkening in some way, implying some sort of force that the pink can connote things that deal with gender in different ways. And these three figures also figure in multiple paintings as these sort of three graces, or also horsemen of the apocalypse in different ways as they witness this happening. And they're also crouching behind this boundary. And for them, there's sort of this question about, well, like, is what's happening beyond that boundary safe? As the sky changes in these witnessing change images, some figures are really welcoming that. This painting is intentionally, this figure is sort of relieved that there's some broad reckoning where the sky is on fire with this pinkness and redness, and also brings up that an intense change requires preparation and collaboration. And so you start seeing figures doing these vague preparatory processes across the works. In Noxious, I'm going back and thinking about whether this change is bringing in something infectious or mind-altering or harmful in some way. And this figure of me in the foreground is sort of breathing in these pink diamonds that are proliferating the space. And while that's happening, the eyes are sort of pinkening, sort of implying a shift in view in some way that could be good or bad. And I did make this painting after the pandemic started, and so I was wearing a mask outside, and I just sort of left it in to imply that there's either a lack of a willing lack of protection against a force, or unwilling lack and exposure in some capacity. And these figures in the background, those harbingers of the apocalypse in different ways, are doing this ambiguous ritual. One of them sort of has their head in their arms, and it's a group of 4 white women in this white house behind the figure, sort of enacting some sort of ritual in this space. And I'm sort of asking, like, is whatever this ritual is going on, is this a positive force, that things are coming out of this house that is propelling these pink awareness bubbles or something into the environment? Or is what's going on within that like solipsistic and besides the point of this greater, possibly destructive and infectious force that's going through everything? And I'm just also thinking about them in the background as performers going through this ritual, and sort of in some ways they could be helping each other and going through a ritual of communal healing, but they could also be doing something that's wasting time in the face of an oncoming threat. And then this is just a work in progress that sort of follows up on that past painting, the idea of these diamonds proliferating through the space and figures sort of encountering strange bodies within the field and in certain ways. Sky's Bleeding in this painting, I'm really thinking about the way that when a change happens and our families and the people that we're close to interface with those changes, there's often like ideological or intergenerational friction. So, within the Me Too movement, for example, the way that women of different generations or different experiences were interfacing with that were really different. And that's the same for a lot of other ways that we've been reckoning with social forces over the past couple of years and basically forever, where sometimes there's someone that wants to turn their back on what's happening. And in this painting, the sky is sort of bleeding into the bird bath, and the two figures in the background are looking incredulously at the figure in the foreground, who is defiantly unwilling to look at what's going on in her community and within her neighborhood. And sort of just thinking about this behavioral this behavioral tendency in a lot of different ways, and that tension that we feel between each other within our families or friend groups all the time. My grandmother said this one thing that was really impactful for me a while ago. She said, pay attention when the sky is bleeding, even if someone tells you it's not. And I really think about that phrase often, where a lot of the times when change is happening or when violence is happening, we're sort of told to look the other way. And in this painting, it's sort of like, well, now that this is happening, now that the sky is falling, what are these figures going to do? And also, what role have they played, either passively or actively, in contributing to this or addressing this? And it's sort of like a big question about how we interact with each other in tense moments, and what we do with these impasses, and just sort of asking those questions. And then lastly, in this section, this painting, Witness. So in this painting of me and my partner in this walk that we took through the woods where we encountered this really strange wishing well, I had it on my phone and was sort of looking at it in a weird way and thinking about that being a potential area where a source of some sort of contaminant or power of the apocalypse or figure that's part of this pink apocalypse could arise. And was thinking about the way that over the past 2 years, my partner and I have witnessed a lot of change and uncertainty in the world through the pandemic, through our racial reckonings in the United States of America, thinking about both of our families' experiences as immigrant families, but in different capacities, and also like along the lines of gender and sexuality, where we're also different. And when we go through moments of change and uncertainty, we have different social positionings and are trying to figure out how to interface with change, but still stand beside one another and look at those changes head on, and just sort of questioning how you best support and stand beside someone together where things interface with us in layered and complex ways. And that can be a really collaborative experience in positive ways, and can be a way that you hurt each other in different ways. And just something I've been thinking about a lot. And so when we witness change, there are ways that when we witness it, it's different. And I loved that in this painting, there was this tree behind us, and there's this moment where I decided that there would be this parallel between the figures and these two trees that were sort of like reaching out of this space and trying to figure out also how to grow. The next section in the talk is enduring wounds, and just sort of thinking about trauma and the way that as a survivor is something that's carried with you forever and wherever you go. And wherever you are, in different ways, some ways that can be seen and some ways that can be unseen and unacknowledged. And the paintings in this section, some of the like historical and art historical references here that are important to me are thinking about the way that as a person who lives with mental illness, women with the mental illness that I have were often lobotomized. And this like terrible surgical treatment of women was done because they have hysteria, because they were sexually deviant, because they were mentally ill, because they were just downright independent. And that sort of weird threat and history is something that I've thought about and that informed these works. And then also thinking about growing up intensely Catholic as a Croatian person, the way that Mariology and divine worship of Mary was there, and also thinking about a lot of female saints who were venerated venerated for their suffering, and the way that they like Saint Catherine of Siena, like the way that you suffer gracefully is part of your virtuousness, and that can be a really toxic thing to absorb, even if in other ways it can be strengthening. But uh, I think about how problematic it is pretty often sort of informed these works. And then also this diamond shape that I use often is a pretty vaginal shape, and it's also found in a lot of depictions of the side wound of Jesus, which is sort of this like vaginal opening in the side of Jesus in a lot of manuscripts and illustrations, and I'm drawn to that form, and also to the idea of stigmata as bleeding, as evidence of devotion, as something that's laudable, and thinking about the way that in performing gender or going through the world with suffering or pain or trauma, having that sort of stigmata and bearing it can be like, oh, like you should bear this pain gracefully, right? But it's also like just such a terrible thing to say or to feel. And I feel myself doing it to myself a lot of the time. Like I just need to cover it up and it will be fine. I just need to keep living and it's fine. And it's sort of not. And in this painting on the left, Pink Apocalypse is sort of relates to the title of the series, thinking about the way that this figure of my grandmother is separated from these two sentinels outside, and has a head wound that's half stitched up and still there, and is surrounded by that proliferating pink infection around her. And I'm thinking about the ways that we can treat each other in ways that we're protecting one another, and we can also treat each other in ways that that bar one another from connection or from growth. And in this painting, it's sort of like what is the difference between inside and outside as these women are watching the sky pink around their house. And this figure could be quarantined, or she could be being kept there against her will by these other figures. And yeah, I think like when we interface with change, there's a potential for those phenomena to be either triggering or to reopen susceptible wounds in different ways. And the Pink Apocalypse is something that can activate that for a lot of the figures within the series in different ways. And there's a lot of like intergenerational conversation happening throughout the series too. On the right is an image where I've got this sort of over caricatured self-portrait that runs through the series, where I'm sort of wearing this Peter Pan collared dress that is kind of 60s too, thinking about lots of images I've seen of my grandmother. And this figure of me is sort of this like martyred figure that's both a captive and a monster throughout the series in different ways. And that figure too is often like a martyr or like self-efface in different ways. And in this image, there's sort of this like red mark that's right through the front of the head, almost like effacing the self or effacing the identity. And she's totally stoic about it. And she's sort of like living as a symbol of what she should be for her identity, and is still sort of hollow within that. And yeah, just that figure throughout the work is just indicative of like a performance of gender that can be toxic in different ways that I find myself falling into a lot of the time. And also just sort of thinking about the felt pressures of performing femininity can be really intense. And something too that is a big part of that for me is the fawn response to stress, in which it's one of the lesser known responses to acute trauma, where it's not fight, it's not flight, it's like, okay, let me just like behave in the way that my attacker or persecutor wants me to, so that I endure the least harm, right? And so it's for me like a heavily gendered performance when I find myself doing it, even in like everyday stressful situations that I like fight myself on and judge myself on for doing it. And it can be something that's like advantageous to give in certain ways and bypass conflict, but sometimes you're just doing that for survival. And so with this figure of me that's wearing the Peter Pan collar dress, I also just think about the way that she is in this moment where you're unsure if she's actually willing to be undergoing this kind of cutting in or cutting out of this pinkness, or whether she's a good or a bad character. And that character, that part of me that is really pressured to perform the perfectionism and thinness and dull, muted response of white femininity and supplication, is like a figure of me that can create a lot of trauma and stress for other people around me, and is someone that I'm always at war with, trying to get the better of and have more agency with, and try to get her to be like, come on, man, you don't have to do this, right? You don't need to bend. You can keep going, right, without hurting other people or permeating other toxic patterns of behaviors. But yeah, a lot of the influences for these works too also are images where artists were sort of intensely self-supplicating, or I just love the Piero del Francesca painting of the resurrection, where he's so super stoic. And a lot of my figures where the figure is undergoing intense trauma or being cut into in different ways, they look like totally passive to that pain. And I'm sort of critiquing the expectation to be passive to undergoing, toxic forces of rape culture and gender performance as well. In this image, pink on the inside, I'm thinking about the pink wound as something that's enduring and glowing, and it's sort of stapled and sewn in this image in a way that's also pretty vaginal. And here I'm thinking about that wound as being something that could be from trauma, but also something that could imply the feminine power of birth. And thinking about these figures with the pink gloves interacting with it, a lot of the time dealing with emotional trauma or things that are heavy emotionally or psychologically in general is seen as women's work on an everyday basis, as are the practices of bearing children and dealing with children and childbirth. And there's this strange ritual going on in this piece, and you're like, well, is the figure that's laying down hiding that wound? Is she proud of it? Is she a specimen to inspect for how this wound has affected her, and how does she feel about it? And so just asking those kinds of questions about trauma and about how we talk to each other and share trauma as well. And then this is a recent work that's included in the show, and it's still just a studio shot, but I was looking at a lot of religious paintings of saints too, where, someone's completely lost their head as well. And here, like, the two older figures that are looking in on this other figure are sort of judging this figure who's lost her head. And so I'm kind of making a visual metaphor there for the way that we deal with pain and judge each other for the ways that we deal with pain or mental illness, or anything that happens to us. And this is another one where I'm like more literally thinking about receiving stigmata, and that being like a mark of something that's positive, but something that's really painful, and it's still something I'm questioning within the work. So ending this section and transitioning into the next section, which is about imagined reckonings, I'm going to play a short clip from Game of Thrones, which seems like a really strange source for me to be talking about, because it was a show that often included really problematic and careless treatment of women and sex throughout the show. But this is a scene where Sansa Stark is confronting her uncle, who knowingly married her off to a violent psychopath. And the interaction that followed, I found, was a glimmer of hope for justice, healing, and redemption in an unexpected place. And the way that it's framed really frames a lot of the way that I think about the work, and I think about the way I talk about trauma within the work. So just gonna play it.
You have no idea how happy I am to see you unharmed.
Unharmed? What are you doing here?
I rode north with the Knights of the Vale to come to your aid. They're encamped at Moat Cairn as we speak.
To come to my aid. Did you know about Ramsay? If you didn't know, you're an idiot. If you did know, you're my enemy. Would you like to hear about our wedding night? He never hurt my face. He needed my face, the face of Ned Stark's daughter. But the rest of me, he did what he liked with the rest of me, as long as I could still give him an heir. What do you think he did?
I can't begin to contemplate.
What do you think he did to me?
Lady Sansa asked you a question.
He beat you,
Yes, he enjoyed that. What else do you think he did?
Sansa. I don't...
What else?
Did he cut you?
Maybe you did know about Ramsay all along.
I didn't know.
I thought you knew everyone's secrets.
I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. I underestimated a stranger.
The other things he did, ladies aren't supposed to talk about those things, but I imagine brothel keepers talk about them all the time. I can still feel it. I don't mean in my tender heart, it still pains me so. I can still feel what he did in my body standing here right now.
I'm so sorry.
You said you would protect me.
And I will. You must believe me when I tell you that I will.
I don't believe you anymore. I don't need you anymore. You can't protect me. You won't even be able to protect yourself if I tell Brienne to cut you down. Why shouldn't I?
So ending on the why shouldn't I, and also thinking about the way that Sansa was literally saying that, you know, I can still feel it in my body, right? This is a good segue from the healing from wounds and the imagined reckoning section where she's asking, like, why shouldn't she stop Brienne from cutting him down? In the scene, she doesn't tell Littlefinger what happened to her. She forces him to conjure the image and say it out loud, and he's no more comfortable talking about rape and sexual assault than we are in our own world. Many survivors keep their histories of sexual trauma to themselves because it's been impressed upon us that it's a shameful secret and makes others uncomfortable or causes them to cast blames on victims or excuse themselves from the way that it might contribute to rape culture, even if it's by silence or inaction. And often we hear people begin sentences with things like, not all men. Sansa owns her truth and casts aside politeness towards the comfort of others, rather than taking on the emotional labor of telling him what happened to her outright. She commands him to painfully confront the violence he enabled and to stare into the face of her pain. It's important to me that while Littlefinger himself is not Sansa's rapist, she challenges a man in her life whose existence and privilege hinges on a system of exploitation that allows violence towards women to exist. And so in this section of imagined reckonings, a lot of the paintings are revenge fantasies, which are phenomena that many survivors experience, which are intrusive, persistent thoughts of vengeance that are associated with feelings of rage and against your perpetrators and general disgust with the world for injustices. And these imagined reckonings and revenge fantasies can feel good because there's a sense of regaining power and having some sort of control and having pleasure at the suffering of someone else. But when that feeling fades, it leaves you with, it can often leave you with feelings of shame or guilt. But also on this slide are images from popular culture of films and movies that have these imagined reckonings and revenge fantasies, which are satisfying to watch, but also painful because it's not the real reality. A lot of the images in Pink Apocalypse image such things. In this work, Susanna and the Vigilantes references the series of art historical works about the story of Susanna and the Elders, where Susanna is, her privacy and her body are invaded by invaders in many different iterations of this story. And in the biblical story, lots of bad stuff happens to her in the justice system as well. And I wanted to imagine what this story would look like if Susanna had kind of like an army of bad bitches there to save her after or during some sort of encounter. And I am also thinking about historical images of the same of similar stories by artist Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a survivor herself, and reinterpreted that clause to make the woman in the painting seem really uncomfortable. Artemisia is a big influence on these works. Thinking about her series of Judith and the maidservant before, during, and after a reckoning. And just this sort of moment of pause just after, I found really fascinating and have drawn from a lot within this series of works. Oh, something I also forgot to mention was just a lot of these works with the imagined reckonings have multiple versions of me and multiple selves, sort of thinking about the ways that when you go back and replay things that have happened to you, sometimes you wish that you could defend yourself in different ways, or get justice, or have multiple versions of you taking on different parts of the scenario in different ways. In these images, when I was at the Golden residency in 2019, there was this giant vat that was 6 feet long, and when I encountered it, I thought, oh, like that would be great for dissolving a body. And I was like, there's something really wrong with me for having that thought. But I made a series of paintings where these women are like sort of like Judith and the maidservant, in moments of pause, or amidst doing something. They're also sort of self-referential to painting, dissolving this with this giant can of turpentine or about to set it on fire. But they're also sort of looking at each other in the second one and uncertain methods, like, was this violence right? Is what we're doing right in certain ways? And these are some of the influences for this imagined reckoning section. Other images that I'm thinking about, these imagined confrontations, are Not All 14th Century Rats and Tit for Tat, where the protagonists are like assaulting the viewer in some way. You're sort of below them and at their mercy. And you know, I'm also using this caricatured version of my aunt, who's a nurse and has this like, I've seen it all attitude, and caricaturing her in this way where in the Pink Apocalypse, she sort of, it seems normal to her that that vigilante justice is just happening, and that she's just sort of there and present, and has this attitude of like someone's mom who you really don't want to mess with their daughter or their child in any way. She's just sort of there. And in a lot of ways, I'm thinking about these figures as like rebelling against the male gaze in certain ways. But I'm also like asking questions about whether that violence towards any viewer that's encountering these paintings is right. The figures do seem unflinching in front of their houses and cars. And so they're protecting themselves or defending themselves, but they're also in positions of defending the privileges that they still do have. In Badlands, these same two images of my grandmother and my aunt are also drawn on to contrast with this moment where these little girls that are in bridesmaids dresses at a friend's wedding are kind of kicking the shit out of this guy in the suit. And they seem totally unfazed by this going on behind them. And it's sort of like normalized in this way. And I'm asking about what if it was normal to have justice in certain ways, but also is that okay? And then also just these generational differences where one generation maybe has different attitudes on how to handle injustice and turn their backs on it, while another may be more confrontational, are things that I've thought about within there. In sharp practice, this figure we're behind this figure, and in this position where we're asking like, why are we behind her? Is she defending something, or is she out to hurt people in some capacity? She's got this sort of like distortion happening where her ulna is stretched further than it really should be, and she's digging this knife behind her back so hard that it's maybe almost drawing blood from her. And I'm sort of asking where she's standing guard, why, and when. And why we're behind her. Are we with her? Are we against her? What causes her to be in the position that she is now? And then this image too, I paired with Two Fridas by Frida Kahlo, and thinking about the ways that multiple parts of yourself can be both really different and then also support one another ultimately. And thinking about the ways that the adult Danielle, who has traveled out and done a lot of things, has been a professor, made it on their own as an artist, builds stuff, is an organizer in some capacities, and the Danielle that's tempted back to behaving the way that she was raised to behave by culture and by her family are often at odds when they deal with the situation. But here they're sort of unified in their intent to really come at the person who wronged them the person or force that's wronged them in some capacity, and come at them and not turn on each other as they do in a lot of the other images. And so there's the figure in the foreground I really love because she's got this like babushka on, and it's something that I totally love, but also I'm just totally becoming my grandmother in different ways. There's different parts of me that handle stress differently and look at situations differently, and I'm still trying to come to terms with how to negotiate with those things. In this image too, the moon is about to hit the earth in this moment in the pink apocalypse as the houndstooth pattern comes forward to us, and their mouths are covered with masks for protection from the contaminant. And it's also winter, so here I'm also sort of thinking about time passing or change of seasons within this fictional setting that I've made up. There are a lot of uncertain relationships that we have with others when we encounter change or are amidst tense social forces. And those can be between people within the same peer group or other peer groups. And the paintings in this part of the talk confront each other in uncertain or mistrustful ways. One of the first things that my friends asked me when I started this series was like, what are the men doing like as this is happening? And the first thing that came to my mind was that maybe they wouldn't be in groups. Maybe the idea of like the American cowboy who does things on their own and deals with stress and trauma and everything in without wanting to share, connect the dots with that with others is where they would be. And for me, it was sort of this like uncertainty and this distancing about, not seeing a lot of cis white men in my Instagram stories or in my life speaking up about injustices in any capacity on social media. And that's, not the most important thing, but even within the last couple weeks with things that have happened in Texas, I've seen very little advocacy in that particular light. And so there's a lot of uncertainty of like, who's really your ally and who actually wants to talk to you and hear you out and hear each other out. Then also thinking about like this Joanna Newsom quote where it sort of asks like, have I had a hand in your loneliness? And am I like part of a force that's reinforcing toxic masculinity in the way that you're feeling like you have to process your emotions and interfacing with the world? Because not just women are survivors, and there could be ways that amidst the forces of the pink apocalypse, these figures are reckoning with their own thing as well. But in these works, I found myself putting distancing mechanisms up, putting them on the top of a mountain or behind a big thing of foliage, and not being fully with me, and maybe at an impasse, and maybe being willing to talk or listen across the divide, but not being sure. And I had a studio visit recently with critic John Seed, and he was like, I feel like you have to have a better entryway for men in these works. And I said, well, what about the way that there was very little entryway for women in works of art for like hundreds of years? And then that's just thinking about the binary. And I still am reckoning with questions like that about this work and about my work in general. In these two works, I'm thinking about the ways that we can, in benefit of the doubt, a lot of the times we put up walls to ignore or hide truths that are right in front of us, and that can dismiss or silence the impact or reality of those truths, even if they're defense mechanisms for ourselves. And in Slip, I'm thinking about agency as an imperfect practice. And these hands that are in the foreground are in a moment of confrontation of this figure who's evading them, but they're also hesitating in this way. There's this like unstable relationship between inside and outside as the figure conjures the apocalyptic magic to sort of almost shoot these diamonds at this figure who maybe has done something wrong, but there's this moment of hesitation. And the way that when we know people who have been parts of forces that have done harm to us or people we care about, we sometimes still hesitate to do the right thing, and that's imperfect and something to reckon with always. In this image, Breach, the figure in the foreground is separated from the figures in the background who are underneath this tree where the pinkness is sort of proliferating, and multiple versions of the Peter Pan collar Danielle are coming out of this tree at us. And I'm asking about, like, is this some sort of origin of the apocalypse? Are they performing some ritual to call these apocalyptic harbingers and the pinkness forward? Or are they sentinels keeping this at bay? But there's a tension too, because the figure in the foreground is masked from whatever that force is in the air, and the figures in the background are not. And that front character that's looking at us and challenging us, do they have a difference in belief from the figures in the background? Are they is this figure there to spy on them? Is this figure enabling them? Is this figure intimidating us from not crossing this boundary? And I'm also just asking about access in this painting, because there's this wall or gate that's like who is involved in whatever this ritual is and who is not, and why, and what does that mean? I think there's a lot of ways that the things that we think about for ourselves can be self-involved versus things that we might need to share and invite others into our space to discuss. In Undaunted, kind of following up on some of those lines of thought, the figure of me in the background with this dollhouse is sort of absorbed into the apocalypse as these the evil Danielles proliferate from the pinkness, and thinking about the ways that within a crisis, sometimes we withdraw into ourselves and into our worst patterns in ways that have the capacity to make us blind to the ways that can hurt those who love us. And also thinking about the ways that breathing certain toxic things in could be hurting us and causing alarm to those around us in various ways. In Hostel, we've got that figure of me again as this larger than life figure who's standing in front of this giant suburban house and a giant wood pile that's wrapping around the entire perimeter. This figure of me is sort of both a victim and captive, and also a monster in the face of the figures in the foreground. And I think about the way that I've mentioned, the way that we can sometimes protect our own, the shrapnels of safety or privilege that we do have in ways that are hurtful to others, and thinking about the ways that these figures in the background are so comfortable that this like giant Danielle is going to stay with them in the safety of this like giant house and do destructive things at their bidding. Thinking about the ways that that gender pressure operates, especially for white women, where if you behave according to how the patriarchy and how whiteness wants you to behave, then you are afforded certain privileges and opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise, but in ways that are also spreading immense harm if you don't question those things. And there's this other Danielle on the ground with the denim on, who's kind of like the more cowboy Danielle that's got more agency, who's trying to reckon and reason with this figure as these diamonds proliferate from her and hurt people in the foreground. You've also got this giant hand in the foreground holding onto this diamond that makes us question our own implication into what's going on. And also there's still a lot here that's not understood. there's also, in the foreground, there's this confrontation and bargaining that's happening between two different groups within the painting, amidst this crisis, amidst this apocalypse. And there's also, two figures in the lower part of this that are working on some sort of like collaborative healing while all of this ensues. And so still just sort of this painting being about interfacing with yourself and interfacing with social forces in the wake of crisis in important ways. In Conjuring Agency, the last section of kind of broader themes and topics in this work, the works are sort of about finding ways to cope that can restore a sense of confidence in your personal power and agency, and also still thinking about the duty that we have to our loved ones and to our communities outside of ourselves. And I just love this Adrienne Rich poem where she writes, "I'm bombarded, yet I stand," and thinking about the ways that we can be resilient and living and testaments to the things that we witness in ways that can be empowering or change building. And in the face of things that are wrong, what can we burn down? And then also, what can we conjure and what can we build? And in the image on the far left, these figures are sort of just ambiguously burning something, and that sometimes burning down what's there or burning something or destroying something takes bravery to build anew. And in the figure on the right, I've started thinking about whether the figures in this apocalyptic setting can conjure and harness the apocalyptic magic in ways that maybe can clear contamination within their environment, or can be cast as a spell or a wish to protect loved ones or influence their trains of thought in different ways, or just be indicative of a desire to summon some sort of change in awareness or behavior in different ways. And that's new too, just this figure on the left being sort of like a teenage girl with the other two more adult figures conjuring some sort of power and magic that doesn't seem like it's hurting her or hurting anyone. It seems like a source of mystery, at least right now. And how do we like foster better patterns and more fluid paths for those around us going forward in different ways? And then in Soldier, thinking about the ways that these two works being about rites of passage in different capacities, the women in my family have prepared me to go out in the world and are sort of, just like adjusting my shirt before I leave, the way that that's like a common gesture where sometimes you're like, man, get off me. I don't need to be adjusted. Just let me go. But it's also this gesture that says like, it's our blessing that you sort of go out. We have hope that you're going to go out into the world and do something good. And so I think both of these works have a lot of resolve and hope that there could be something positive built for the figures within them. And this is another work in progress that falls within the same category. And then the most giant work that's within the series is Whisper Network. This painting is pretty giant and took me the whole time of making this series. So different trains of thoughts were coming in and out while I was making this painting. And a whisper network is something that, when we talk about abusers that might be parts of our community in different ways, is, women in the case of talking about people that don't treat women well. A whisper network could be a group of women that convey the news to each other under the radar that someone's not so great. And a whisper network in this painting can be also a source of empowerment and agency building and movement building in different ways. In this painting, it was sort of going off of what I said about conjure, where you're thinking about, well, what can I build as a safe place? What can I do for the people around me? Thinking about the way that in crisis, especially over the past 2 years, my impulse has been to like pull all the people who I love close, right? And how do you actually do that? And painting is a space where if you can't really make something happen in the real world, it's always a space that you can build a new one, right? And so the women here are able to sort of come together and stake out some sort of space together and pass knowledge or pass tools to one another, collaborate on things, watch what's happening. And they've got this sort of hub. And I think that that question of what can we make and what can we build is a positive one, but I also recognize that it's still a painting, right? It's still like a futile effort in the grand scheme of things of like, how do we make sure that we're all safe, and the different ways that issues about safety are different for different ones of us based on different experiences and layers of identity and social location that we have. And I was thinking about, what wound up happening with Sansa Stark in Game of Thrones. Later in the show, the same awful person, Littlefinger, attempts to pit her and her sister Arya against each other. And he uses the differences in their ideologies, experiences, and even gender expressions to do so. But the two sisters turn on him unexpectedly and hold him accountable for his unforgivable actions. And Sansa uses Littlefinger's words against him and says, "Sometimes when I'm trying to understand a person's motives, I play a little game and I assume the worst. What's the worst reason you have for turning me against my sister? That's what you do, isn't it? That's what you've always done. Turn family against family, turn sister against sister. That's what you did to our mother and Aunt Liza, and that's what you tried to do to us." Problematic narratives about gender, especially as they intersect with the patriarchy and white supremacy, are saturated within our society and embedded in every aspect of our lives, whether we want to admit it or not. Those with less privileged identities and social locations are often pitted against one another or isolated from one another by larger systems of oppression. And rather than dismantling larger systems of injustice, we often build walls around ourselves and focus on maintaining what level of privilege and comfort we're afforded under those structures, ignoring differences and interconnection, and inevitably just focusing in our own pain, which inevitably benefits those with the most privilege. Who is the Arya or Sansa in your life that you're misunderstanding or been forced to misunderstand by someone else's influence? And what barriers stand in the way of your active listening, empathy, and actionable solidarity? How can we work together to confront a metaphorical Littlefinger? And these are still really big questions that I'm still wrestling with in this work in different ways and thinking about how to be responsible about it. But, the women in these houses have ventured out of their houses. They're sort of interfacing with giant crises that loom before them and impact them and their communities in different ways. And in the paintings, they're just trying to figure out what to do. And I'm still trying to figure out what to do for myself and within my family and within my community as a professor and a person living in rural Western Kentucky, and as a, pan woman living in the 21st century, and as a white woman living in a time of intense reckoning in our country in different ways. And the painted space offers a place to do that. That is safe, even in other ways that's not. So yeah, these are just a couple of like zoomed in moments of this painting where a lot of the people that are important in building a safe place for me as a survivor, for me as like a person from a family of immigrants, for me as someone who's fluid in how they feel about gender on the inside, even if I'm overly femme on the outside, and whose knowledge and reframings of the world, I have, and I owe so much to these people that have supported me. So that like largest painting is the biggest one in the series, and one that's wrestling with the biggest overall questions of them all is, what roles do we play in interfacing with change, and how do we keep moving forward personally and as a group? So that's basically it about the Pink Apocalypse works.